Thank you so much for that welcome. I just want to start by thanking the Center on Behavioral Health for inviting me to be here. It's a very big honor and a very big pleasure to share this work with you that I love so much. I'm here to talk to you today about Nordoff-Robbins music therapy. Nordoff-Robbins music therapy uses improvised and individually composed music to promote self-actualization. It was created by two men, Paul Nordoff and Clive Robbins. And I didn't know Paul Nordoff. He passed away before I came into music therapy. But I knew Clive Robbins very well. We worked together on a daily basis for 15 years. And I traveled throughout the world teaching this work and lecturing with Clive. And nothing gave him more pleasure than to share the work with people all over the world. And so he passed away about 1.5 years ago. And for me, sharing this work with you is my way of honoring him. So I just wanted to let you all know that that's how I continue his work, is by sharing it with all of you. And I thank you for being here and for having an interest. So we're going to begin with some music, because that's what Clive would like. Not so much talking in the beginning. And we'll start with some music and a view of the two men who created the work, and we'll hear a little bit of a description of the work in their own words. This video is from 1972, and it was taken from a television program from Norway. It was a demonstration of their work. What happened was Paul and Clive met these children on a Friday, and then the next day a television crew came and filmed them working with these children they had just met. This first excerpt illustrates the delicateness of Nordoff's playing, the sensitivity, and the clarity of his musical statements. You'll see he begins very simply with a single note melody, and he gradually builds this experience for the child. And he interacts with a little girl named Karen through a shared change of tempo and dynamics, or the loudness of the music. By the way, all of the all of the information about the clinical examples is on the handout. So if you want to know the source of them, the particular therapists or the particular clients, you have that information in front of you. Okay. We're going to get rid of that background music. Okay, so Paul Nordoff was born in 1909. He's the therapist at the piano. He taught piano and music composition at the University of Michigan and Philadelphia Conservatory in the United States. And for 10 years, he was a professor of music at Bard College. Clive was born in 1926, and he worked as a teacher at a residential school called Sunfield in England. And it was a school where the arts were used therapeutically. And it was based on something called anthroposophy, which is it's not a philosophy and not a religion, but it's a combination of the two. and it's more about a certain way to live one's life. So it has certain spiritual ideas and certain human values connected to it. If you've ever heard of the Waldorf schools, the Waldorf schools are all based on Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. So Nordhoff was a composer and a professor, as I said, and he was very interested in this anthroposophy. And so he took a sabbatical from his job as a professor for a year. He was given a leave, and he made a tour of anthroposophic homes throughout Europe because he had heard that they were using composed music to work with disabled children. And this led him to this particular school called Sunfield in England that had a reputation for using the arts therapeutically. And there he encountered Clive Robbins's special education class. And Nordoff began working musically together with Clive Robbins in his class. And gradually they developed their method together in this year they spent. So Nordoff's year sabbatical was over, and he wrote to his dean and college president in New York and said, I've discovered this wonderful way to work with disabled children through improvised music, and I need another year to try to see how it can be developed. I need another year of a leave. And they said no. So even though he was 50 years old and had a family, he said, okay, then I quit. And he left his tenured faculty position as a professor to create this method of music therapy to work with disabled children. So they worked together for another year, and then in 1960, they came to the USA. And they worked together from 1961 to 1967. They worked with some projects with children with autism and children with emotional problems. And then in 1962 and on, they did some projects with physically disabled children. Then from 1967 to 74, they combined international travel, teaching, writing. They wrote 3 major books at this time, and demonstrating their work all over the world. So we're going to look at one more example from that Norwegian television show. And it shows this, what the work was like at near the end of their partnership. This is 1972 again. The music is in a pentatonic scale, which just means that it's a scale containing 5 tones. And it shows them working with a boy named Tommy. And you see them working to help Tommy become more flexible in his playing. They want him to have more expressiveness in his music. They want him to develop some personal strength. And there are a few ideas that underlie working in this way. The primary assumption is that a lack of flexibility in music reflects a lack of flexibility in life. So if a child can only play a drum in one tempo, at one speed, then that child can't have emotional experiences that might require faster music or slower music, or music that accelerates, or music that slows down. Right? The compulsive use of one tempo means that person can only have a very narrow range of emotional experience. So by bringing flexibility into Tommy's music, they're enlarging his capacity for emotional experience in the world. Okay. You'll see in this work, there's always 2 therapists. One works at the piano to provide the ongoing music, and the co-therapist works to facilitate the client's participation. One of the reasons we do this is we don't want to have to stop the music in order to help the client play. So if the client is physically disabled, the co-therapist might just help hold someone's arm up. If the client is a very hyperactive young boy with autism running around the room, then I'll have to run around the room and chase him and bring him back to the drum. And that's why you see, two people in the room. And that's part of what makes the work so effective. So, as I said, that tape was from 1972. Paul Nordhoff died in Germany in 1977. And shortly before that, Clive then began working with his wife, Carol Robbins. She was also a musician and a music therapist who had begun studying with Paul and Clive in 1966. And they did a lot of their early work was with hearing impaired children. And that might sound strange to you. Music therapy for people with hearing impairment, right? But the reality is very few hearing impaired people are completely deaf. Most have some type of residual hearing. And they worked with this residual hearing. They did a pilot project that was funded by the government, and it led to the publication of a book, Music Therapy with the Hearing Impaired and Other Special Groups. And again, all the books that I'll mention today are on the literature list that you've been provided with. So let's look at an example of some work with hearing impaired children. This work is not improvised. Here they're using a song called One Bell by a woman named Jane Gibson from the UK. And Clive's narration explains the rationale. But the basic idea is that a positive orientation towards auditory experience that facilitates emotional development for all humans, including those who are hearing impaired. And I'll say for those of you who are listening to the interpretation, what Clive is saying now has also been provided in writing, I think, to everyone. Is that correct, Venus? Yeah. Okay. All right, so this is from 1983 now, Clive and Carol Robbins. I will say, you don't have to wait till the end for questions. I'll stop 2 or 3 times during the 2 hours. So if you have a question, maybe just write it down, and then we'll take 2 or 3 little breaks, and I'll take a few questions at that time. So you've seen a little bit of the work. Now I will talk a little bit and give you some of the underlying theories and ideas behind this work before we look at some more video. First, the work is primarily improvisational. You heard Nordhoff say, if you can't improvise as a musician, then you can't respond to what the client is doing. And you'll see what makes this work most effective is instead of asking a person with a disability to come into a structure or come into our world, we use the music to reach into somebody else's world, to make contact with them. The idea is that we take whatever the client does naturally with an instrument or with a sound or with a movement, and we create music around that natural expression. And so the client can't help but eventually feel that connection, that the sound the person's hearing, the music, is related to something the client is feeling and to what the client is doing. Also, because the music is individualized and improvised, the goal is self-actualization. That means the goal is to find that inner force in the client that wants to become more fully human. and to use music to stimulate that force and support it. The model is what we call very music-centered in music therapy. You know, there are different approaches in music therapy. Some are more strictly medical and scientific. Some are more psychoanalytic. The Nordoff-Robbins model is what we call music-centered, because you can see music is the primary field for interaction. We're relating to the client through the music. Music is the primary area we're seeking to affect change in the person. Changes in the client's music is how we assess progress in therapy. And so the idea is we're using the creative and expressive essence of music rather than using it purely as a medical intervention, say. The work is very individualized, right? The therapist creates music for that client in that moment. A lot of the work is improvised, but we also videotape every session. That's why we have all these wonderful tapes to show you all. And what the therapists do is they watch the videotape after the session, and they find what music really seemed to work with a client. You know, what music seemed to engage a fearful person and help that person come out into the world more. And so then we'll make music notation of what we played, and then we'll bring those melodies and motifs back in subsequent sessions. So even though the work is improvised, we have these structures that are created for each client individually that kind of function as the skeleton or the structure for the improvisations. The aesthetic dimension of the music is really important. The nature of the music and the quality of the music, that's really what engages the client. And you'll see, especially Nordoff, Carol Robbins, who we're going to see in a moment, they all had this real gift for creating music that had beauty to it. And that's because they could perceive that beauty in the person, no matter how disabled. And by perceiving that inner being, they created music which reflected what they were finding in the person. Sometimes people hear this music and they think, how can you make such complex music for someone who might be very severely disabled? And we say, well, doesn't that person deserve beautiful, complex music also? We would rather make the mistake of overestimating someone's capacity rather than underestimating the capacity. And as you'll see on the examples, when the music is right and suitable for the clients always do respond. We also talk about something inside the person called the music child. And it doesn't matter if the client is an adult or a child, but we use this term music child because the original work was all done with children, although later on it's been applied with adults too, and you'll see some examples of work with adults today. What is the music child? Well, we feel that within every disabled person, there's a core, healthy part that's not touched by the disability. Right? There's a core in that person that responds to music and can be reached through music. And that's what we call the music child. And we feel that music bypasses areas of disability, whether the disability is physical or cognitive or emotional. We find so many people are able to function at higher levels and in a more human way through music. So what Nordoff-Robbins music therapy does is reach into the person and find that music child. We awaken it and stimulate its development. And once the music child comes out, we bring in new and challenging musical experiences to help consolidate a new and healthier sense of self. Okay, that's a lot of words. We're going to look at an example, a nice example of the music child being awakened here. We're going to look at a little boy named Morgan. Morgan is 4 years old, and he developed normally until he was 18 months. But at 18 months of age, he stopped trying to communicate. He stopped trying to make eye contact with people. He became obsessed with objects. So here was a boy who was showing the classic symptoms of autism at that point. His therapists are Alan Turing at the piano and Clive Robbins, again, is the co-therapist. And we're going to look at two examples with Morgan. The first one is from his first session. He accepts this situation, which is really challenging. There are two large men in the room who are responding to everything he does through music. So it's a demanding situation, but it's also at the same time very accepting, because he can't do anything wrong. Whatever he does with the music, Alan Turing at the piano creates a context around it. So what that Morgan does gradually assumes intentionality and communicative significance. And by Morgan just picking up the drumsticks and playing with them, he's indicating that he wants to relate to other people. He wants to express himself. He wants to communicate. These are the very things that the symptoms of autism say he shouldn't be capable of. But what we typically find is that it's the verbal level that the person has problems with. So when we give a child with autism an alternative communicative medium like music, all of a sudden their desire to come into to make contact with other people is awakened. Right? So it's not that they're just in their own world, it's just that they're shut out of the world of language. But given an alternative world, they're able to relate fully. Okay, let's look at Morgan. You could see Morgan's musical intelligence being awakened. He has an innate understanding of the musical phrase. Then he punctuates it with the symbol. And then he goes back again to the small Xylimba, right? Let me ask, can you see the excerpts are okay, or should we maybe turn off the front row of lights? What do you guys think? Can you see okay, or would it be helpful to have the lights off? You can see all right? Okay. All right, we'll leave it like that. So let's look at one more example with Morgan. The next one is from his second session. And you'll see his playing gets divided into repeated, subdivided phrases. He enjoys his expression and the creative coactivity with Alan. He shows nice dynamic variation, right? Loud and soft. Again, one of the classic symptoms of autism is what's called being perseverative. You know, that a child will just stay at one tempo and almost play like a machine. Or maybe just go to the piano and play in a very mechanical way, every single note up and down the scale. So when you have a child with autism who's showing flexibility and responsiveness, you've now awakened an alternative path of being in the world that's not limited by the symptoms of autism. Okay. Work is improvisational, but it's improvisational in a compositional approach. The work sounds very pre-composed almost. It's very well formed. And there are approaches in music therapy which are just free-form improvisation because of a different theory about, you know, the release of the unconscious. But Nordoff-Robbins is different. It says it's important to improvise within structure. So it's important to find a balance of freedom and structure. Both qualities are needed in equal amounts for human development, right? So we're going to look at an example, and this is probably one of the longer examples that I'll show you today, because I really want you to see the long arc of an improvisation and how the therapist creates a motif and then gradually builds this motif so that it becomes a large experience for the client. In the 1980s, Clive and Carol Robbins spent much of their time in Australia. And this example is from their work there. It's with a boy named Solomon, or Solly. And we can hear how the musical materials the therapist uses very, very simple. It's just a very simple melody. But you'll hear what the therapist does by changing the harmonies or the notes around it to give a richer experience to the client. And again, a lot of the examples you'll see the client's beating a drum or a simple percussion instrument. The reason for this is we don't want to spend time teaching someone how to play an instrument. That can be very frustrating. So we use instruments that sound very good, that are good quality, but that don't require a lot of training to play. Right? Instruments that anybody could walk up to and create a pleasing sound right in the moment. In this example, Solly's playing the drum again, and just keep in mind, in Nordoff-Robbins thinking, the client's not beating the drum, but he's beating the music. In other words, the drum is the vehicle through which the client is able to live in the music that's created together. Okay? I just want to say one or two things about that excerpt that I noticed today. First, did you see when Solly goes to like bite his hand, gets very excited? And typically what you'll see professionals do is they'll grab the person's arm and say, don't do that. But instead, what Carol does is just hand him another drumstick. So rather than telling him what not to do, she tells him what to do. Play with two hands. And I think that that very simple little intervention illustrates, you know, one of the prime philosophical foundations of the approach, that we work with the pathological behavior to transform it rather than saying no or trying to stop it. We accept it and transform it rather than trying to, you know, squash it, because that's who the person is. And that's who the person is in the moment. And what kind of message is it if we say don't, no, stop? Instead, we give an alternative. The other thing, you'll notice most of the examples have singing. And really, the human voice is one of the most important tools in this work because it's seen as the most personal and the most intimate form of expression. So even though the method emphasizes the use of piano and other harmonic instruments, the voice is very, very important, whether the client is verbal or not. You know, they don't always sing in words, but there's always a vocal presence in most of the excerpts. We'll look at one more example, and then I'll take a little pause and maybe ask some, see if there are any questions. Another aspect of the approach that's important is this emphasis on musicality, right? It's the therapist's musicality is important, but so is the client's. The therapist's musicality is important to create music of aesthetic character. and also to be able to create music of a sufficient diversity to match all the potential clients you might work with. I mean, think how challenging that is. If you have to create music with different, if you have to create individualized music for each client, you have to have those musical resources within you as a therapist. But also the client's musicality is important because it's felt that the client's creative and musical abilities represent the healthy. And that's what Nordoff-Robbins work does. The theory is to work with the healthy parts of the person, to work with the strengths, and emphasize the resources. The next example is also with Carol and Clive Robbins, and they're working with a little girl named Nicole. Nicole is visually impaired, and she has autism, and she has multiple severe medical problems. But from her very first session, she showed real musical gifts and musical sensitivities. And it's really only in a music therapy setting like this where someone's listening and can hear the musical intelligence that Nicole's intelligence can meet another person. And I have to say, just as an aside, I did a research project on Nicole. And part of the project involved going to observe her in different milieus, different aspects of her life. So I went to her home and saw what her life was like there. And I went to her school to see what she was like there. And I watched all her music therapy sessions where, as I said, she was one of the most musically gifted children with autism I'd ever seen. But then I went to see her at school, and what I saw was tragic. She sat in a corner of the room all day, manipulating, playing with, stimulating herself. And the highlight of the day was putting little circles in a box with a hole, and then finding another box with squares and putting squares in that hole. For most of the day, she was caught up in her own world. And it made me realize how important that 30 minutes in music therapy was. Because it was the one time in the week where her intelligence was activated, where she could be a full human being. And so whether or not what we could do in music therapy changed her life outside, it was still so important because it was like giving her a lifeline. It was, again, the one time in the week where she could really be in a fully human way. You know, you can see a little bit of her autistic tendency. She's pushing Carol away. It's like, I'm in my own world. I don't want to hear you, you know. But Carol's, I'm here with you, and I'm not leaving. I'm playing with you. We're doing this together. And, you know, I just want to emphasize, yes, Nicole was musically gifted, but music therapy isn't for musically gifted people only. Our belief is that musicality is a universal aspect of humanity, and that all people require a relationship to music to be fully human. And so that we see our job is to try to find that musical part and awaken it. So let me just pause for a moment and see if there's maybe a question or two or three that I could take at this point. I know sometimes it's very hard to hold a question for 2 hours, so if you have anything particularly about anything I've said so far, about any of the examples or about the work in general. You know, for the next 2 days, we're doing an intense workshop on the work, so I'm not going into detail on the theory and things today. So any questions? Anybody? Yeah. Oh,
it seems that they know their boundary. I mean, like when they're given a drumstick, they just play with the drum. They won't hit the piano with the drumstick. But when I see the little girl there, and she was just given piano to play, and I mean, like, they know their boundary. It seems that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question again.
I mean, like, they seem to know their boundary, which is that when the little children, when they're given the drumstick, they just hit all the drum or things that they can hit with, but they won't hit the piano.
Okay, so I think the question is, the children seem to have very good boundaries. Yes. They take the drumstick and they use it appropriately on the drum, not on the therapist or on the piano. And, you know, of course, but it some children have that naturally, and some children, you give a beater and it stimulates their aggression too much, and they'll throw it or maybe hit somebody. So then we'll take the sticks away and give them a hand drum. So just because I've shown you examples like that doesn't mean we have problems with boundaries. We do sometimes. But again, there's never a reason to remove a client from a session, because once I remove a client, I can't do anything for that person. It's my job to find out how to work with the client's limitations. And if it means hiding all the drums, or hiding the drumsticks and using a different instrument, then that's what I'll do. So you work within the physical and the motor limitations of the client to help them make music. Yeah. There was a question in the back. Yeah. We're going to use the microphones because it's a big room, and this way everybody can hear the questions and the answers. Yeah. Use the microphone, if you don't mind.
All the clients you've shown are children. How about adults?
Yes, we'll see some of those. Yes, we will see adult clients. I'm showing the early work now, and it was developed with children. The original two teams only worked with children, but they created many training centers throughout the world, and the more contemporary therapists started working with adults in psychiatry, in a medical hospital, even people who are not disabled, but who are just seeking an alternative form of therapy. Working in this, you'll see some work with geriatric clients too.
So the approach will be similar or different for a different age group?
Is the work similar or different, you ask?
The approach.
The approach. No, it's remarkable. The approach is really similar, whether you are working with children or adults. The principles apply very well, regardless. And even if someone's fully verbal and articulate, the work is still music-centered. We still try to channel the client into the musical expression, again, because of this belief that the music, the desire for music represents the person's healthy part. So you'll see some examples, and I think you'll see the same principles when we do the work with adults. One more?
I noticed drums and pianos were often used. Is there any special function or reason behind, and are there other choices of musical instrument used in this kind of therapy?
So the question is, so far we've seen mostly drums and cymbals with the clients and piano with the therapists, right? And I would, again, there is, you'll see some other work with other instruments. One of the reasons you see a lot of drum and cymbal is that, again, it doesn't require skill or a lot of training. We also use a lot, like different tuned percussion. Like Morgan was using that little xylophone, that pentatonic xylophone. So I would say we use all instruments, although we tend not to use, so we would let the client play the piano, like you saw with Nicole, but probably we wouldn't bring a violin in or a saxophone, because it's so hard to get a pleasing tone out of it. You spend years, right? So we don't want to have a steep learning curve. but we will see some other examples with other instruments. A couple at the end. We'll take two more and then we'll go back to the video.
I just want to ask, how do you motivate the client, the children, to start the section?
How do we motivate?
Yeah,
to
how
start?
to facilitate them to use the musical instrument so that we can start the section?
So the question is, how do we facilitate, how do we motivate the children to use the musical instruments? And I know this will sound a little trite or glib, but we open the door, we start playing, the instruments are there, and children see it, and they just, typically they go right to it. That the wonderful thing about music is that it's intrinsically self-rewarding. We don't have to motivate or give the child a reward like in a behavioral approach. The music is its own reward. And so we don't have to struggle to engage the client's participation. Now, the client may play in a way that's reflecting the disability or pathology. So the struggle is, how do we work with the response to transform it? But usually, the participation we don't have to coerce. It's usually engaged in fully. One more question, and then we'll go back to the video.
I'm just curious, what about if a child have a tone deaf?
Tone deaf.
Yes. So would it affect it by languages? Or with the music, can we tell that a child have tone deaf? Learning problem of languages?
Yeah. So everyone heard the question, if a child is tone deaf. Now, tone deaf is a phrase we use, but it's not so well understood, really, what we mean. Because people who are tone deaf, they actually hear different pitches as different, but they may not hear, like you and I hear one is higher and lower. All they hear is different sounds, and they don't hear the relations, tonal relations that most people hear. I would say with many of the disabled clients, it's hard to know if they're tone deaf or not, but I would say much of the work can occur rhythmically. So, you know, some clients, because of their disability, like with the hearing impaired clients, maybe they're only instead of hearing a tone, they're just hearing a dull thud. But they're hearing a sound that stops and starts in time. And so we can't really know another person's inner experience, but we can still find a way to work with whatever the person can do musically. Okay? Okay, good. We'll go back to some video, and then we'll take another break like this. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to everyone's question, but we'll have more time later. Now, something we do in Nordoff-Robbins work is we use all the styles and scales of music in the world. So you'll hear Western music, like with Nick Cole and Carol. You heard this very Western style, what we call diatonic music. But you'll also hear different scales from Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa. You'll hear whole tone music. Here, maybe I'll, since we have a keyboard, it was working before. Let's see, grand piano. Everyone can hear that, right? Yeah. Okay. So for example, there's something called organum music. It's very ancient sounding music. There's something called whole tone music. It's music that has no resolution at all, right? It just seems to float there without going. So in Nordoff-Robbins theory, we use different styles and scales with clinical intention. And I think that that's one of the defining, and that's actually one of the unique characteristics of this music therapy model. None of the other models in music therapy really talk about how the particular music you use is reflecting your clinical focus. So I like to say, really, a lot of music therapy operates on the level of, say, folk healing, right? What a folk healer can do is know that a certain plant might help a certain condition. But the folk healer may not know why. You know, in modern medicine, we talk about the chemical properties of a medication and how it interacts with the biology of the human body. Well, in music therapy, it's almost like most music therapists work at the level of folk healing because they can't really tell you why they play particular music or why that particular scale has an effect. So in the beginning, I was telling you, you know, Nordoff-Robbins is not in the medical scientific end. It's more on the artistic, creative end of music therapy. However, in this one regard, I think Nordoff-Robbins' work is more scientific than just about any other music therapy approach, because it's the only model that talks about the specific scales and tones and intervals you use and connects that to your clinical intention as a therapist. So let's listen to one or two examples that illustrate this aspect of the theory. We're going to hear an example with which is what with a Middle Eastern scale, which kind of sounds like this. Okay, everyone heard that? I think everyone did everyone hear okay? Yeah, I think it's okay. It's loud enough. Oh, you're going to put it in the air? I don't think we need to. Yeah, thanks anyway. But we'll do that after. What characterizes this style is what we in music call dissonance, intervals that tones that clash. That's called a minor second interval. There's a lot of tension in that interval, right? So that music, it's very stimulating. It's also very provoking. It can be very confrontational. And so what we do in Nordoff-Robbins is think about, well, what's the particular interval of a scale and how might we want to use that in a clinical situation? So if you really want to stimulate a client or challenge a client, you may want to use Middle Eastern music because it has that quality. Yeah. So we're going to have an audio example now. Nothing to look at. Just use your ears. The work here is with a boy named Terry. And it's the first moments of his first session. He's very isolated, Terry, and he's one of these disabled children who just sort of is in his own world. It's almost like there's a haze or a cloud around him, and you can't really penetrate this haze to reach him. So as a result, Nordoff decides to use this Middle Eastern music. Now, you know, I think some people think that that can be intimidating or frightening for the child or too challenging. But Nordoff felt that challenging a person with a disability is actually showing that person a great deal of respect. It's saying, you know, you can be challenged, just like all human beings are challenged. How do we grow as people? We are challenged, and we develop a resource to meet the challenge. And so Nordoff felt it wasn't cruel to challenge a child with a disability. It was the ultimate sign of respect and honoring that person's being. So you'll hear the music here. It's very forceful. It's very clear. And it's also very provoking in a way. And I get, every time I listen to this example, I get this image of a fisherman. And you know, if you've ever fished, you know you have to entice the fish to take your bait and to come on the line. But if you pull too hard, you lose the fish. But if you don't pull it all, you don't attract the fish. And I hear Nordoff doing that in the music. It's Terry's playing the drum, and Nordoff, he catches him, and they play together for a few seconds. And then Terry falls off the line. You know, he loses the fish. But then he gets him back a little bit. See if you hear that interpersonal dynamic in the music. So you can hear Nordoff, he's trying to draw the boy into coactivity, into some kind of mutuality, right? Well, one more example of using a musical style, but a much different style this time. We're going to see some work with a guy named Lloyd. And by the way, I've put some books on a table here at the end, so when I'm done, we'll stay around a while. There's some books you can look at. And Lloyd was the subject of a book, a case study with a DVD. And Lloyd was very interesting. He was 27 years old when he started therapy. And he worked with Alan Turry and myself for 7 years in therapy. He was very severely intellectually impaired. He had no functional skills in language, socialization. He had no fine motor skills. He needed help just getting dressed in the morning. He resisted all forms of human contact. He resisted being taught anything. And he really didn't focus on anything at all for more than a few seconds at a time. But again, when he came into music, he showed real musical intelligence and sensitivity and motor skill and an ability to focus far beyond what he could do outside of music. And we began using a lot of pop music idioms with him. Blues music, rock music, jazz music. Why? Because when Lloyd went to an instrument, and he played guitar sometimes, sometimes drums, sometimes piano, he played in a way that the natural thing to put around it was either blues or rock or jazz. So you're going to see in this excerpt, he's sitting at a drum set. And just the way he played the cymbal sounds like a jazz drummer. Now, he's very disabled. He's very uncoordinated. So you wouldn't mistake him for a professional. However, you can tell he has the basic feel that if he hadn't been had something very unfortunate happen in life, he might have grown to be a musician. Many of the goals you'll see with Lloyd, you can frame in terms of very concrete terms. Maybe we're increasing his ability to focus, or maybe we're increasing his impulse control, or maybe we're enhancing his ability to take directions from others. But what we found is we could do all of these things within the conventions of the musical style. So on one hand, you could say, you know, we're working on stopping and starting, or we're working on communication. But what we're really doing is just working on playing jazz or rock or blues music in a stylistically appropriate way. Because that's what Lloyd wants to do. That's what the client wants, right? The client wants to play music. The client doesn't want to work on impulse control or focusing ability. And so what we found that in this approach, it's more important to adopt the client's perspective and get behind that and support that rather than imposing our therapist mindset that we have to have some non-musical goal. Because the paradox is it's easier to achieve the non-musical goal when you're not focusing on it. In other words, if the client feels like we're just here to make music together, the client's going to function at a higher level, and then you get all these wonderful goals in motor skills, cognitive focus, and emotional expression. But you get them by not focusing on them. Okay, so let's take a look at Lloyd. So you could see what we're doing there is very, very typical in a jazz style, right? Where you play and then the band stops and the drummer keeps playing a little bit. And that's what I mean by using the intrinsic quality of the style with the clinical focus, right? Because Lloyd's being a jazz drummer. He's not working on stopping or starting or working on autonomy. And that's what I meant before when I said we use the intrinsic qualities of the musical styles with a clinical focus. Okay, I'm going to just give a little hint to our interpreters that I'm going to be skipping ahead in our presentation a little bit. And we're going to move to Excerpt 11. Okay. So we're going to now look at some work that doesn't use instruments at all, that just involves singing and words. And this is an example of work in a group with 4 adolescents with developmental delays. And 2 of them have autistic features. One of the clients, Diane, she says to the client next to her, Brandon, "Did you miss me?" Now, this was really an amazing thing for her to say because she had not been in the session the previous week. And she's really showing remarkable interpersonal awareness. She's concerned. You know, she's saying, "I wasn't here. Did anyone know I wasn't here? Did you miss my presence?" She says, turns to Brandon, who's very much autistic, and says, "Did you miss me?" And then you see Alan Turry at the piano and Laura Beer, the co-therapist, they start turning this into a song. And this song became a stable part of the group's repertoire. Every time somebody had missed a session, when they would come back the following week, they would sing this song, "Did you miss me?" But you see how the repertoire for the group comes out of the group process. It's not just a therapist bringing in a song. Here's a song I know, let's do it now. It's taking the human reality the clients are living through, forming that spontaneous verbalization into a song. And then what's really remarkable, even though they're creating the song in the moment, you see the clients, they've internalized the form really rapidly. And I think, you know, that's an example where, again, I say we're working with the client's strengths because you can see how cognitively, even though they're very delayed and have autism, they're able to very quickly understand and remember the musical form right? It's not just understanding it, but it's remembering it and being able to function within it. That example also illustrates something important about the value of music therapy. Because if you've ever worked or if you know any people with autism, when they're verbal, you know that you can teach them to use words in an appropriate way. So they can be taught, hey, when someone leaves and you comes back, you say, I missed you. But you don't really know if they understand the emotion, what it feels like to be missing someone. You don't know if they're connecting the word to that emotion. And I think the music, right, carries that feeling, expresses what it's like to miss somebody. And so I think what the music does here, by carrying the feeling tone of the word, it helps, for example, someone with autism to not just learn to use the word in the right context, but to know the feeling that the word is representing. Okay, move on a little bit. How are we doing? One of the prime aspects of music that Nordoff-Robbins music therapy is based on is this idea of stimulating the human will, nurturing and stimulating the will. Many areas of disability can be understood as a deficit in the human will. A psychiatric patient may not be able to overcome fears, or a stroke patient can't move an arm, right? So whether it's physical or emotional or cognitive disability, it can be conceptualized as an inability to activate one's will. Well, the interesting thing about music is that many music philosophers talk about music being patterned after willful action. That there seems to be a way that certain tones strive for other tones to reach completion. That in its essence, music is an oral representation of the human will. And Oliver Sacks, a neurologist who writes about music, has talked about something he calls quickening, which is the phenomenon that music seems to stimulate the will, which then stimulates the body to move. So it's not like music is this mechanical force that just activates the body, but there's the human spirit that intervenes, right? The spirit and the will is activated, which then in turn activates the music. And this ability of music to stimulate the body and to awaken and to stimulate movement is also used in Nordoff-Robbins' work. And we're going to look at two examples with adults right now. And again, I think to answer the question we had before, you'll see the exact same principles. The work really is no different. The first example is with a client named Carl. Carl, this is work from the Nordoff-Robbins Institute that was in Germany. Carl was a 20-year-old man who liked to play American football. And he had a broken leg playing sports. And the broken leg developed complications, and he had a series of surgeries. And then when he was being transported from one hospital to another, he had a heart attack, and he was left clinically dead due to loss of oxygen to his brain. He recovered from that, but he was left with devastating neurological damage. Initially, he could not move, and he couldn't speak. And he eventually regained some movement in his arms, but his movement was slow, painfully gradual. So when he came to music therapy, you know, his movement was so slow, he'd take his arm and he'd bring it down to the drum or the cymbal, but his movement was so slow, when it finally reached the instrument, it didn't even make a sound. No, there was no fluidity or continuity to his motion. And it's this fluidity or continuity that characterizes music. So his music therapy work involved helping him to appropriate this quality of motion in music, to help it imbue his physical motions with more fluidity and continuity. And it's really the musical phrasing that the therapist uses on the piano that supports his movements physically and that gives them a communicative intent. Carl's story is told in the book Music for Life by Gary Ansdell. Again, it's in your literature list. And his therapist is Peter Hoffman from the Institute for Music and Music Therapy in Germany. Okay. I just want to make one more comment about that example. There's anybody who's got a musical background at all? Any hands up? Anybody? Very few. Okay. There's something in music called a cadence in Western music. And this is what a cadence sounds like. Right? It's a series of chords. The first one, the second one. Now the second one creates musical tension and it needs some sort of resolution. So you hear this. And very often in Western music, when you have a cadence, there's a temporary pause in the music. Now, what's interesting about this excerpt, there's almost no use of cadence. It's just on this D minor tonality. It's got some other tones, but nothing like this. Why? Well, the whole focus with Carl is to try to get him to move, to stimulate his motion. If you play a cadence, it kind of makes someone stop. So maybe if you had a client who never stopped, then maybe you'd use music with a cadence because it might suggest to the client to pause. But with Carl, the whole goal is to facilitate the movement, not to stop it. And so again, it's another example where the music is used very deliberately. Now, there is one place in the music where Peter uses a cadence. There was a moment where Carl just stopped playing, and he kind of looked frozen, right? And then you heard Peter do this. That's half the cadence. So when you hear that, what your mind wants to hear is this, the resolution. That's the tension in the music. And then your mind wants the resolution. So when Carl kind of got frozen, then Peter played the tension, and then Carl played. It was almost like he desired the resolution. So the therapist playing the music with tension then stimulated Carl to play. Again, it's just the kind of thinking we do in Nordoff-Robbins music therapy, looking at the real details of the music and determining what to do based upon our clinical focus. We'll look at one more example of this concept of quickening, right? Using music to stimulate someone. The client's name is Hubert, and the therapist is a woman named Alla Braverman at the piano, and her co-therapist is Michelle Ritholtz. Hubert's a very distinguished 81-year-old man. He has Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. He's unable to support himself. He needs a wheelchair to move. And he requires assistance in all activities of daily living. He basically sits frozen. I mean, he's alive, but he's almost existing as a human statue. Earlier in his life, though, he was an actor who acted and sang on Broadway. And that's an important fact when you see what happens. So Alla at the piano is creating a greeting song. She invites Hubert to sing. Nothing. He's just sitting there frozen, locked within this Alzheimer's. She eventually tries an improvised song, a tango, which is very rhythmic, with rests in the music. A rest just means a pause. So the idea is, if you want to invite someone's participation, you leave a space for them to participate. If you constantly play, the person has nowhere to come in. So the idea is, if you're inviting someone in, you create a space for them to come into, a space in the music. What they sing, and I'm doing this for the benefit of the interpretation, she sings, "Do you want to say hello in music today?" She also says, "It's nice to hear you singing." Okay? Let's take a look at Hubert. So you can see that many symptoms of Hubert's diseases are circumvented in music therapy. He's relating in the moment to a spontaneous and fluid situation represented by the improvised music. His vocal skills are awakened with all the implications for neurological activity and muscular activity that this implies. And his activation is social as well, right? He responds to Allah, and he communicates a self-initiated thought to her. Yet, to me, what's most striking is that his musical self is experiencing a rebirth, illustrated in the melodic and the expressive quality of his singing. It's quite beautiful. And for the duration of the music, he's reclaiming his identity, who he is, right? His identity, his sense of self has been taken from him. It's been robbed from him because of these awful diseases he's suffering with. But in the music, it's restored. And it's restored in a unique way that really can't happen through any other modality. So I promised you another question and answer period. I think what I'd like to do is this. There's a few examples of group work I want to show. So let me just finish the video in the formal part of the presentation. And then if certain people have to leave, they can leave. And I'll promise to stay here and take your questions as long as you want to be here, okay? But let's go through and watch the last few excerpts so that people who cannot stay will have the ability to leave then. So we're going to look at 4 examples of group work now. And I'll show them in chronological order so that we see work with very young children all the way up to work in geriatric care with people with dementia. So the first example is a group of 3 6-year-old boys, and they all have language deficits and autistic feature. And we're using a song that was composed by one of our therapists. It's called Reverie. It's by Michelle Ritholtz. And the music, the song creates a very calm, very serious mood that if you know 6-year-old boys, whether autistic or not, that's not how they tend to be in the world, right? But the music is so beautiful and so engaging that they're kind of taken in by it, and they're able to sit and focus and play the instruments because of their desire to be in that music. And what this example illustrates is how we use composed music and improvisation in a very flexible way. So what we do here, we start out playing the song. The song kind of establishes a mood of focus and calmness. Now that the clients are sort of focused and calm, now we start improvising. And then when the improvisation draws to a close, we come back to the form of the song. Again, it's something you see in jazz all the time. Jazz players play the melody, then they improvise, and then they come back to the melody of the song at the end. And this is important because if we just improvised without any form, the person might have a powerful experience, but then the experience is forgotten. There's no label for it. There's no sort of box in our mind where that experience is stored and can become the foundation for creating a new, stronger personality, right? So the intense experience is necessary in music therapy, but alone it's not sufficient for personality development, right? The intense experience provides the gratification and the motivation, but then the structured music helps the experience be remembered from week to week, so that rather than just an isolated sequence of intense experiences that never build, it becomes the fact that it happens within a composition means that it becomes kind of like a building block for the personality. Okay, we'll take a look at this song. The therapists are me and a woman named Nordoff-Robbins, who was Clive's third wife, actually. I'll tell you about Clive's life over some beers one night if you want. What number was that? You saw one of the boys push my hand away, right? Well, what happened there was the song, as it's composed, only has the bell part. It doesn't have these other instruments. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, we're going back to the song now, so the other guys should just sit and listen and let Seth, the one boy on the bells, play alone. And then the other guy pushes me away when I try to stop him. And that was an example of me being rigid or inflexible. You know, we say the clients can be rigid or inflexible. Well, what about the therapist? And because I had in my mind, well, that's not what how the song is written. Who cares, right? We had just shared this really powerful, beautiful musical experience. So it just made sense that we should all play together at the end. So luckily, I wasn't so stubborn. I was able to give in to that, to the other boys' impulse to play together. Let's look at another example of group work. Now, here's an interesting example with a group of older adolescents. They're in a supportive program to move out of special education and to get a job. So these guys are all 17, 18, 19 years old. They're leaving the public school system and going to a job. They're actually in a program called the Transition Program that helps them leave special education and find work. So there's a lot of goals. Help them learn how to express themselves constructively and work out difficulties, learn to get along with others, learn how to function in a group. And we're going to play, this example has a pre-composed piece with each member of the group who takes a turn as a conductor. And this illustrates the art of clinical composition. So the therapists, who are Alan Turry and John Buchanan, wrote this composition specifically for this group. And I want to show this example for two reasons. One, it shows how to use contemporary popular styles, like we saw with Lloyd. And this is really groove music. It's Latin music. A lot of these kids are Puerto Rican and Dominican, so they're from a neighborhood in New York City with a lot of Hispanic people. And so we're using here the music that's very culturally familiar to them. But, you know, some people think, well, this work is fine for developmental delays, but not for kids who might just be more, have emotional needs, but be really aware. And it shows that they respond in the same way, that as long as the music is developmentally and culturally appropriate, they don't feel that it's too infantile to play these special instruments. They're willing to play those instruments as well. Okay. It was especially good for the boy who was doing the conducting. The other guys were kind of street tough kids. He was kind of what, you know, in English we call a nerd. I don't know if that word translates. Very uncool, the opposite of cool. But here he got to be in a leadership position and respected by the other guys, right? So it was really good for him. So one final excerpt, I won't say much about it. It's work in a psychogeriatric facility. So this is elderly people who also have psychiatric problems. And it just shows some work. It's by the Western composer, Norwegian composer, Edvard Grieg. And it's just taking this piece of classical music and arranging it for use in a music therapy group. So we'll just play this last example so you get to see what the work looks like in a geriatric setting. That is number... The art here is that each client's challenge is very simple. But together, you know, they create something that none of them could do alone. It might be too challenging for any of those clients to sit and learn the whole melody. But each client just has to play one note. And so in that way, they get to feel part of something larger than themselves, right? And again, for clients for whom so much has been taken from them because of their disability, this is restoring their ability to feel, to become a meaningful part of something larger than themselves. So just some closing words. Nordoff-Robbins training programs exist right now in New York and London and Scotland and Sydney and in Seoul. Some of the programs, such as New York, requires the person to already have a graduate degree in music therapy. Other programs, like in London, allow a beginning music therapist to take training in this approach as they're getting their degree. There's an international trust of Nordoff-Robbins music therapy that oversees different aspects of the training programs and the use of the name. And now you have a small group of Nordoff-Robbins music therapists in Hong Kong who are getting together and promoting the work and the model locally, which is nice for you guys. But you can see often the work is dependent upon some sort of charitable contributions because it's incredibly labor intensive. There's 2 therapists in every session. That's what makes it work. Plus the therapists have to videotape and watch the recordings. And someone has to film the session. So for every hour of clinical service, there's like 5 hours of human labor. And, but, you know, I think these people deserve it. So much has been taken from them in life, and I think they deserve whatever we can give them in terms of an ability to be restored and have a fully human experience. So with that, maybe anyone who has to leave should leave, and I'll start taking questions again, okay? Oh, thank you. Oh,
yeah,
question, yeah.
I have 2 questions. One is, what are the limitations for this music therapy?
The limitations?
Yeah.
can you say what you're thinking a little bit?
Because just like I've trained in play therapy, and play therapy is able to regulate the emotion problems for the children and behavioral problems.
Okay.
But it is not able to tackle the autistic disorder. Still, there is.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. So the question is really, what are the limitations of the application of the work, right? Yeah. Now, what you saw today is sometimes we work on a motor goal, physical, sometimes on cognitive, sometimes on emotional, so that the work can be like physical rehabilitation or psychotherapy. But again, you know, nothing can cure. You can't take an autistic child and cure the autism, or take someone with schizophrenia and cure schizophrenia with music. But what we feel you can do is help that person become as fully human as he or she can be within the limitation imposed by the disability. So as Clive said, we can't normalize someone, but we can help that person realize their full human potential. And I don't think there's any particular area of disability that this work can't be done with. And I also know people who are not disabled, but who are seeking, like, who might have life problems, relationship problems, can also work within this form of therapy. Alan Turing wrote a book and his doctoral dissertation on his work with a woman named Maria, woman like you or I who had cancer. And she didn't really want to have traditional medical treatment, and she wasn't really sure what to do. And she said that she prayed, she was a religious person, and the answer that just came back is she should sing. And she had no idea what that meant. What do you mean, sing? And then she took some vocal lessons, but that wasn't right. And she was telling the story to her dentist. And the dentist said, well, I have this other client, patient, who does this thing called music therapy. Maybe you should see what he did, what that's like. So she went into music therapy with Alan Turing and spent 10 or 15 years in therapy with him. It completely changed her life. Initially, she went in because she had cancer and wanted to deal with problems around that. But it eventually came, she began dealing with all of her life issues. And so it's just to say the work works with the most disabled of people as well as the highest functioning of people. Okay?
Sorry, one more question.
Sure.
So how do you evaluate the improvement on the clients to prepare for termination?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. How do you evaluate a client and prepare for termination? Now, when you were dealing with people with chronic conditions like autism or Down syndrome or schizophrenia, people like that can benefit from therapy their whole lives. And so how do you then terminate with someone, or why should you terminate when someone has a condition which requires therapy? But you can see that this way of working is incredibly labor intensive, and it's not meant to be just a supportive therapy. So like, for example, with Lloyd, the guy who played the drums where we were playing jazz, Alan and I saw him for 7 years. But when we charted his growth, we saw a long period of growth, and then he kind of reached this plateau where nothing really changed. And so we could have kept working with him to maintain him there. We couldn't justify the amount of resources devoted to his care. So I'd say, you know, in doing this kind of work, when you feel the client has reached a plateau and isn't really progressing in a significant way, then perhaps we end with the person. And that doesn't mean the person shouldn't have therapy, but maybe he can be in a therapy that isn't so labor intensive and so specialized. Okay, thank you. Good question. Next. Yeah, in the back.
May I know if the music therapy is also effective in treating occupations like a patient with suicidal tendency.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want to know, are you asking specifically that or the general application in psychiatry in general?
General.
Yeah. Personally, I have most of my experiences with children with autism and adults with schizophrenia. And I would say that it is very effective, one of the most effective modalities in psychiatric care for a few reasons. One, if you've worked with people with schizophrenia, for example, one of the biggest difficulties is that they can be very suspicious or paranoid. And if they think you're a doctor or a therapist or you come in with a tie and a white coat, all of their fears and paranoia is realized. Many folks like that don't think they have any mental illness. They don't even know why they're in therapy. But when they come to music, in their own, sometimes they say it's music time. They don't call it music therapy. Now, it says music therapy on the door, and they know, part of them knows it's music therapy, but we don't have to challenge their defense mechanism because now we have a reason to be together. It's not about talking about your problems. It's about being together in a way that doesn't evoke all of your standard fears and resistiveness. And we can now meet musician to musician rather than doctor to patient. You know, the doctor to patient evokes an authoritarian hierarchy, which is the absolute worst thing to do with people with mental illness. And so when you have this alternative medium to be together in, it really creates trust and relationship in the most suspicious of people. Now, specifically in working with people with suicidal ideation, I think music's especially effective because there's something about music which represents the life force. You know, there's a real strong connection between being creative and creation of life. And when people play music, they feel, my belief, and I can't prove this, it's just it's one of the assumptions of the work, that music activates the life force within us. And so for someone with suicidal tendencies or ideation, to me, activating their music self provides a counterbalance to that. It provides the impetus to want to live and not just take one's own life. So I think those areas, schizophrenia and especially in suicidal ideation, it's particularly, and paranoia, again, because of all these reasons, it's a really ideal medium.
I'm just curious, why do you have to tape it? You save one person labor if you don't tape it.
So the question is, why tape it? Well, there's a few reasons. Again, one, when we're working improvisationally, we find themes and melodies and motifs that really engage someone. Now, I want to bring that melody back next week. But if I don't have the recording, I have to remember everything I played in the session, which some people can do, most people can't. So one reason is to be able to analyze what happened. The other reason is when we're in the session, we're very involved in our creative, intuitive self. And now what gives us permission to do that is when we're watching the recording, we're very analytic and critical. And so we balance the creativity in the session with the analytic and critical mind in the analysis. And last, a lot of times good things happened in the moment that we didn't know. So for example, an autistic child must be going, ah. And then when I notate those notes, I feel, oh, I thought those were random sounds, but now I see they were reflecting the chords I was playing on the piano, something maybe I didn't hear in the moment. So there's all those reasons to do the recording, and that's why it's not essential in all forms of music therapy, but I think in this particular form it's essential. Yeah, down here. I feel like one of those TV hosts, you know, walking around.
Should I go to the center?
Yeah. Come on down. You win a refrigerator.
No. I don't know whether I heard a wrong information that you got an assumption that people play music will have happy mood.
Happy mood.
Yeah. When we do some therapeutic modality with the patient or client, they pop up some sad mood. How can we handle it during the session, or we have to move them out for individual treatment? Am I clear?
Try one more time.
I heard about the assumption that people will stay music with happy mood, right? So when we play some modalities, for example, movement or music, the client maybe pop up some sad mood or emotional.
Yeah, okay.
How can we handle it? Thanks.
So I think the question was generally, there's an assumption that music makes people happy. And I would say that's not an assumption that any music therapist I know would say. What music does is connect us to our feelings, whatever they are. Sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're tragic, sometimes they're sad. And as a music therapist, when we bring music to someone, we're evoking the emotion that's there. And so now we have a professional, ethical responsibility to help the person manage the emotion. So, you can bring that into the group process. We would never take someone out of a group because they're feeling sad or angry or whatever it is. As a therapist, we don't value and say certain emotions are approved and certain are disapproved. Instead what we say is all emotions are part of our experience as human beings, and music is broad enough to contain and express all different emotions. Now, depending upon your model of therapy, that will determine what you do with the feeling. If someone starts feeling very sad in a session, in some models of therapy, you would ask the person to talk about, what are you thinking? Why are you feeling sad? What are you remembering? And then you move in between words and music in the therapy to help the person understand the feeling. Sometimes a person's not cognitively able to discuss the feeling, so you just let the person feel it and let it be expressed in the music. And oftentimes you feel once you allow the person to do that, they move through the feeling. So rather than pushing it down, we encourage the person to feel it fully so that the person can move on. Okay? Yeah, in the middle here. Oh, don't put your hand on the cover.
Hello, I'm wondering that what is the difference between Nordoff-Robbins music therapy and psychodynamic approach?
Oh, good question. So, my wife, who's been to Hong Kong a number of times actually, she works in something called analytical music therapy. And when people find out we're married, they are shocked. They don't understand how two people from such different theoretical perspectives can be in the same marriage together. Good what? Good match. Yeah, they yin and yang, right? But here's, so the question is, how are they different? I think here's a good example. In analytic music therapy, you use the music primarily to have an emotional release, and then the idea is you use words to interpret the experience. And without interpretation, there's no therapy in that model, because the idea is you have to have cognitive insight into the emotion in order for it to be a valid therapy experience. I think in something like Nordoff-Robbins, we would call it more, it's more what we call a transformative therapy, that we believe the therapy is people being in a different way in music than they are outside of music. And so music can be transformative without having to be interpreted verbally. So it's not like we don't talk with clients. Of course we do, when that's necessary. But the talking might not be about interpreting the experience, that sometimes people are changed by the musical experience itself. And I think that's probably the primary difference as I would describe it quickly. Yeah. Yes, right here.
I thought some people were saying that if you want to be a music therapist, you have to be a real musician, like you really know an instrument, how to play it, then you can study the music therapy. Is that correct? Because I like to use voice, but I don't know instruments.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Well, it depends where you want to study. As you could see like, I'm a terrible singer. And I'm jealous of people like you who have a good singing voice. Because I think the voice is the best tool in music therapy. But you can see, at least in the US and in Europe too, to come into a music therapy education, you don't have to be a fantastic musician, but you have to be able to play either piano or guitar, at least at a basic level, so that you could play songs with people. Some music therapists don't use improvisation at all. You know, it's too demanding. They may not have the musical skill. Or they might improvise with their voice, but play something very basic. People like you who are primarily vocalists, I know there's a lot of music therapy work in palliative care, hospice care with people who are terminally ill. And so they work in bedside, going to people's homes who are terminally ill or working in a hospice. And in those settings, the best tool you can have is a warm and engaging singing voice. But you still have to play at least simple tunes on guitar or keyboard so that you can do songs and music with people. But the fact is, to be a music therapist, at least in all of the Western colleges and universities, you do have to have a certain minimal competency, generally on piano or guitar or both. Okay? So practice.
Okay, so I'm aware that it's 5:35. So maybe we can take the final 1 or 2 questions, because tomorrow and Thursday, Ken will also need to do 2 full-day workshops, so we better leave.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry. I heard about the good sides of music, the force of music. Is there anything evil, like hypnotizing? Because I hear, the voice of the songs, like the hymns, in some countries, like the Islamic, from time to time. But, well, for some people, you arouse the emotion, some bad experiences. Well, he may be out of control, and out of your expertise, control. Is there anything evil from music therapy that happens?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll answer your question, but maybe not in the way you're asking it. And I'll answer it in the way that you're asking, is music therapy ever contraindicated? Because music's an art form. To say it's good or evil or anything, to me doesn't make sense. But I think it's reasonable to say, are there certain people you shouldn't do it with? And I would say, yeah, of course. For some people, it might just evoke such anger or aggression that it can't be contained musically. Of course, you could always work with a person purely vocally or singing. And I would say, yes, there are some people you probably shouldn't use music therapy with, but that's, I've not encountered any. I've encountered people who weren't engaged by it, so maybe it wasn't the right treatment for them because they didn't have any innate attraction to it. But I don't think the music itself, is a bad thing. Although there are certain people, like I said, there might be some people who are very angry, aggressive, that just can't contain the emotions evoked by music. And I think for those folks, you shouldn't use it then. Okay? Yeah, back.
I was here late, so maybe it's already been asked, this question. Basically, I know, like Western music, I know what's going to happen next often. Like say hymns, I can guess, or blues music, I know what's going to happen, right? So you know, I can see the people who have experience of that music can, you know, feel a tension or whatever. They want to complete the music, right? But okay, first one thing is, you know, someone from different culture might have different musical style. So that's one thing. The other thing is, say you've got kids or very young people who have, it seems it's very strange that people who maybe have very little exposure to music can still want to complete it in the same way. We have the same understanding. It seems, I think it's very odd. That's all. Have you got?
Yeah, you know, that really, I think what you're speaking to is what is your philosophy of music? Is the way we experience music just determined individually by psychology, or is it determined by what music is as an external entity? You know, are there any objective qualities of music? And I think the Nordoff-Robbins work is kind of built on the interaction between the two.